Imagine the darkest night you have ever seen. You are floating in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from land. You are covered in thick black fuel oil that burns your eyes and clogs your throat. You are dehydrated, your skin is blistering from the sun, and your legs hang uselessly in the abyssal depth beneath you. You are not alone. Around you, hundreds of men are screaming, but below you, something else is moving. Something ancient. Something hungry. This is the story of the USS Indianapolis. It is the story of the greatest secret mission of World War II, and the horrific price paid by the men who completed it. It is a story of atomic fire, bureaucratic failure, and the primal terror of the food chain. Of the 1,195 men who went into the water, only 316 would come out alive. The rest were claimed by the sea, the sun, the salt, and the sharks. You are listening to History by Blood Audiobook. Welcome to the worst naval disaster in the history of the United States. The nightmare began with a triumph on July 16, 1945. In the pre-dawn darkness of San Francisco's Hunters Point Naval Shipyard, the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was being loaded with a cargo that officially did not exist. The ship, a decorated veteran of the Pacific War, had just finished repairs. After a kamikaze strike, her captain, Charles Butler McVay III, was a man of impeccable pedigree and iron discipline. He was summoned to headquarters and given orders that were as terrified as they were vague. He was told, "You will carry a secret cargo to Tinian Island. You will run at top speed. You will not zigzag. You will not stop. If the ship sinks, you will save the cargo before you save your men." McVay was not told what the cargo was. He was only told that every day he saved on his voyage would cut the war short by that much time. The cargo came in two parts. First, a large wooden crate, roughly 15 feet long, bolted to the deck in the hangar bay. It was guarded 24 hours a day by Marine detachments who had orders to shoot anyone who touched it. Second, a heavy metal bucket, a lead-lined canister carried aboard by two officers and welded to the deck of the Admiral's cabin. The crew speculated wildly. Was it gold? Was it a new type of engine? Was it scented toilet paper for General MacArthur? None of them guessed the truth. The crate contained the firing mechanism and projectile assembly for a new superweapon. The bucket contained the uranium-235 core. Together, they were the guts of Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima. The Indianapolis was not just a ship. She was a delivery truck for the apocalypse. On July 16th, the same day the Trinity test successfully detonated, the first nuclear device in the New Mexico desert, the Indy slipped under the Golden Gate Bridge and turned her bow west. She was a Portland-class heavy cruiser, a Greyhound of the sea. Long, sleek, and incredibly fast, she was built for speed and firepower. And Captain McVay pushed her to the limit. The mission, codenamed Operation Bronx, required absolute speed. The Indy raced across the Pacific, setting a speed record between San Francisco and Pearl Harbor that still stands today for surface vessels. 74 hours. The crew was on edge. The secrecy was suffocating. The officers watching the canister in the Admiral's cabin nervously checked their Geiger counters. Though they barely understood what they were looking for, they stopped briefly at Pearl Harbor, only long enough to refuel and provisions before sprinting toward Tinian Island in Marianas. Tinian was the massive airbase from which the B-29 superfortresses were firebombing Japan. On July 26, 1945, the Indianapolis anchored off Tinian. The secret cargo was offloaded. The crate and the bucket were whisked away by waiting scientists. And MPS. Captain McVay breathed a sigh of relief. He had done it. He had completed the most important mission of the war. He didn't know what he had delivered, but he knew he had done his duty. The crew relaxed. They believed the hard part was over. They were ordered to sail to Guam and then to Leyte in the Philippines to join the task force preparing for the invasion of Japan. They were wrong. The hard part had not even begun. At Guam, Captain McVay requested a destroyer escort for the leg to Leyte. The route crossed the Philippine Sea, a stretch of deep, dark water known to be a hunting ground for Japanese submarines. The request was denied. The naval authorities at Guam claimed that the waters were safe. They told McVay that no submarine activity had been reported in the area. This was a lie, or at least a fatal bureaucratic failure. In reality, U.S. intelligence had decrypted Japanese signals indicating a submarine, the I-58, commanded by Makatsura Hashimoto, was operating exactly in McVay's path. But because this intelligence was classified ultra-secret, it was not passed down to McVay. Furthermore, a destroyer escort, the USS Underhill, had been sunk by a Japanese Chitin suicide torpedo in that very area just days before. McVay was told none of this. On July 28th, the Indianapolis departed Guam. She was alone, she was unescorted, and she was sailing blind into a trap. The mood on the ship was light. The war was clearly ending. The men, mostly young boys aged 18 to 22, were dreaming of home. It was hot in the Pacific. The Indianapolis had no air conditioning. To make the heat bearable below decks, many sailors slept topside on the open deck, using their life vests as pillows. Others slept in the passageways. The watertight doors, heavy steel doors designed to seal off sections of the ship in case of flooding, were left open to allow air to circulate. It was a violation of protocol, but it was standard practice. In the sweltering heat of the tropics, it was a decision that prioritized comfort over safety, a decision made 1,000 times on 1,000 ships without consequence. But on this night, the heat, the open doors, and the lack of an escort would conspire to turn a tragedy into a catastrophe. The sun set on Sunday, July 29th. The Indianapolis was steaming at 17 knots. The night was overcast with heavy clouds blocking the moon. Visibility was poor. Captain McVay, following his standing orders, ceased zigzagging, a maneuver used to throw off submarine aim after twilight. The visibility was so low that he believed he was invisible to any enemy periscope. He retired to his cabin to sleep, but the Indy was not invisible. At roughly 11 p.m., the Japanese submarine I-58 surfaced to recharge its batteries and get fresh air. Commander Hashimoto climbed to the bridge with his binoculars. Hashimoto was frustrated. The war was lost, and he knew it. But he was a samurai of the sea, determined to strike one last blow for the Emperor. He had Chitin suicide torpedoes strapped to his deck, piloted by young men begging to die. He scanned the horizon. Against the black water, he saw a darker shape. A silhouette. At first, he thought it was a battleship. It was huge, and it was moving in a straight line, broadside to him. It was the perfect target. Hashimoto ordered his submarine to dive. He maneuvered into position. He decided not to waste his suicide pilots on this target. Standard Type 95 torpedoes would be enough. He calculated the speed. He calculated the range. He waited until the massive American cruiser was perfectly framed in his periscope, CROSSHAIRS. At 12:14 a.m. On July 30th, Hashimoto gave the order, fire. He launched a spread of 6 torpedoes. He counted the seconds. On the Indianapolis, 1,196 men were sleeping, playing cards, or standing watch. They were sailing toward the end of the war. They had no idea that 6 cylinders of high explosives were racing toward them at 45 knots, closing the distance between life and death. To the men who served on her, the USS Indianapolis, CA-35, was more than 10,000 tons of steel and rivets. She was a floating city, a weapon of war, and for 1,196 souls, she was the only home they knew in the vast hostile Pacific. She was beautiful. Launched in 1931 during the Great Depression, she was a Portland-class heavy cruiser. She lacked the thick, impregnable armor of a battleship, but she made up for it with grace and speed. Her long, slender hull could slice through the waves at over 32 knots, about 37 miles per hour, fast enough to outrun almost anything afloat. She was the pride of the pre-war Navy. She had been President Franklin D. Roosevelt's personal ship of state. Before the war, FDR had stood on her decks, fishing and reviewing the fleet. She had carried him on a good neighbor cruise to South America. She was a celebrity ship, accustomed to admirals, diplomats, and the flash of cameras. When war broke out, she traded her diplomatic paint for dazzle camouflage. She became the flagship of Admiral Raymond Spruance, the genius behind the victory at Midway. She served as the command center for the colossal Fifth Fleet, leading the charge across the Central Pacific from the Gilberts to the Marshalls, from the Marianas to Iwo Jima. She was a lucky ship. She had earned 10 battle stars. She had seen the worst combat of the Pacific and always come home. The crew believed she was charmed. They called her the Indy, and they loved her. Who were the men sleeping in the hammocks and standing watch on the bridge? By July 1945, the crew of the Indianapolis was a mix of hardened veterans and fresh-faced kids. The veterans were the plank owners or long-timers who had been with the ship since Pearl Harbor. They were efficient, cynical, and tired. They had seen the suicide cliffs of Saipan and the black sands of Iwo Jima. They just wanted the war to end. The new recruits were different. Many were teenagers, 17 or 18 years old, fresh out of boot camp at Great Lakes. For them, the Indy was a grand adventure. They were excited to finally get into the show before the war ended. They were proud to be assigned to such a famous ship. Life on board was a microcosm of America. There were farm boys from Iowa, street kids from Brooklyn, and sons of immigrants. Despite the war, life on the Indy had a rhythm. There were movie nights on the fantail under the stars. There was the ship's ice cream machine, a treasured luxury in the tropics. There were endless games of poker and craps played for cigarettes. Crucially, there was a sense of invincibility. They were on a heavy cruiser, surrounded by 8-inch guns and anti-aircraft batteries. They felt big. They felt safe. The idea that this massive steel leviathan could simply vanish beneath their feet was inconceivable. But the Indy was not invulnerable. She carried a scar that explained why she was in San Francisco to pick up the atomic bomb in the first place. On March 31, 1945, during the invasion of Okinawa, a Japanese fighter plane, a Zero, broke through the cloud cover. It was a kamikaze. The kamikaze pilot, screaming down from the vertical, crashed his plane through the Indy's rear deck. The plane's bomb exploded in the intricate machinery of the ship, punching a hole through the hull and flooding compartments. 9 men were killed. The damage was severe enough to send the Indy limping all the way back to California for major repairs. This event is critical to understanding the tragedy that followed. First, it meant the crew on board in July 1945 was a mix of survivors who were jumpy about air attacks and new replacements who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Second, the repairs in San Francisco were done quickly to facilitate the secret atomic mission. When the Indy left San Francisco, she was fully repaired, but she was effectively a new ship in terms of crew cohesion. Many of the men didn't know. The officer standing next to them. In a disaster, that lack of familiarity would be deadly. When Captain McVay arrived at Guam after delivering the atomic bomb components to Tinian, the atmosphere was relaxed. The mission was a success. The pressure was off. The routing orders from Guam to Leyte in the Philippines seemed routine. It was a standard transit route used by hundreds of ships. Captain McVay, a careful and experienced officer, asked the routing officer at Guam, Commodore James Carter, if a destroyer escort was available. Cruisers like the Indianapolis were designed to fight surface ships, not submarines. They lacked sonar gear to detect submerged threats. They relied on destroyers smaller, agile ships equipped with sonar and depth charges to act as their bodyguards. Commodore Carter looked at the charts. He saw that the route was technically designated as safe. He told McVay that no destroyers were available. They were all needed for the invasion preparations of Japan. "You'll be fine," was the sentiment. "The Japs are finished." This was the fatal hubris of 1945. The U.S. Navy was so dominant, so massive, that they had begun to underestimate the desperate, cornered enemy. They forgot that a wounded animal is the most dangerous. McVay accepted the order. He was a career Navy man. You don't argue with orders. He was told the water was safe. He was told he could sail unescorted. He was told he could arrive in Lady on Tuesday morning for gunnery practice. He was not told about the submarine I-58. He was not told about the sinking of the Underhill. Sunday, July 29th, was a quiet day on the Philippine Sea. The Indy steamed southwest at a comfortable 17 knots. The sea was choppy, the sky overcast. Below decks, the heat was suffocating. The ship's ventilation system struggled against the tropical humidity. To breathe, hundreds of sailors took their bedding topside. They slept on the steel decks, looking up at the clouds, letting the ocean spray cool them down. Others gathered in the mess hall. They wrote letters home. "Dear Mom, we delivered the cargo. We're heading to the Philippines. I hope to be home by Christmas." Those letters would never be mailed. In the officer's wardroom, the conversation turned to the end of the war. They speculated about the invasion of Japan. They talked about the GI Bill and what they would do when they got out. Captain McVay walked his dog on the deck. He checked the visibility. It was dark pitch black. He ordered the ship to stop zigzagging. Zigzagging is a defensive maneuver where a ship changes course every few minutes to confuse a submarine's aim. However, Navy protocols stated that zigzagging was not mandatory in poor visibility or at night, as it slowed the ship down. McVay, believing the darkness was his shield, chose speed over evasion. He went to his cabin, took off his uniform, and lay down in his bunk. He was looking forward to a good night's sleep before the arrival in the Philippines. He closed his eyes. Just a few miles away, a periscope broke the surface of the water. Commander Hashimoto was raising his eye to the lens. The Greyhound of the sea, the president's ship, the pride of the fleet, had exactly 1 hour left to live. The ocean is a conductor of sound. In the silent depths of the Philippine Sea, the first warning was not visual. It was auditory. At 12:14 a.m., the sonar operators on the Indianapolis, had they been equipped with the right gear, would have heard the high-pitched, mechanical whine of propellers racing through the water. It is the sound of death approaching. At 45 knots, but the Indianapolis was deaf. She steamed on in the darkness, her bow cutting the waves, her crew sleeping. Aboard the Japanese submarine I-58, Commander Hashimoto counted the seconds. He had fired a spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes. He held his breath. The first torpedo missed. It streaked past the stern of the ship, vanishing into the blackness. The second torpedo did not miss. It struck the Indianapolis on the starboard right side. Near the bow, the explosion was massive. It blew the first 40 feet of the ship's nose completely off. The bow of the ship, severed from the hull, twisted and began to sink, dragging the ship down by the head. The impact threw men from their bunks. It felt, as one survivor later described, like a giant crane had picked the ship up and slammed it back down. But the Indy was a tough ship. She might have survived the loss of her bow. She had watertight bulkheads. She could have remained afloat, crippled, but alive then. Seconds later, the third torpedo hit. The second impact was the Executioner. It struck amidships, directly under the bridge, near the powder magazine for the forward turrets and the fuel oil bunkers. The resulting explosion was apocalyptic. The torpedo detonated the ship's own ammunition stores. A column of fire and water shot hundreds of feet into the air, incinerating everything in its path. The blast wave tore through the ship's interior like a hurricane of fire. It vaporized the forward sleeping compartments. Hundreds of men, Marines, the stewards, the young enlisted sailors sleeping in the forward berths died instantly, never knowing the ship had been hit. The explosion severed the ship's spinal cord. It destroyed the communication lines. It knocked out the electrical power. Instantly, the lights went out. The ship was plunged into total suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the red hell glow of raging fires. Below decks, the world had turned into a nightmare. The ship was already listing, leaning violently to the starboard side. The ocean was rushing in through the gaping holes in the hull. Because the watertight doors had been left open to ventilate the ship against the heat, there was nothing to stop the water. It roared through the passageways, sweeping men away. In the engineering spaces, deep in the belly of the ship, the heat was intense. The ventilation blowers had stopped. The air filled with smoke and superheated steam. Men scrambled up ladders in the pitch black, fighting gravity as the ship began to roll. They were slipping on oil, tripping over debris, and climbing over the bodies of their shipmates. Those who had been sleeping topside on the deck were the lucky ones. They were thrown into the air by the blast, waking up to find themselves covered in soot, looking at a ship that was tearing itself apart. One survivor recalled seeing a man standing on the deck, looking at his hands. The skin had been burned off his arms by the flash, hanging in ribbons. He was in shock, asking quietly, "What happened?" Captain McVay was thrown from his bunk by the first explosion. The second explosion shattered the glass in his cabin. He grabbed his life jacket and scrambled to the bridge. The ship was already listing 15 degrees. It was dark. The internal phones were dead. He shouted for the officer of the deck, but in the chaos, no one could give a clear report. He assumed they had hit a mine or been rammed. He did not know the bow was gone. He ordered the engines to stop, but the communication with the engine room was severed. The engines were still running. The Indianapolis was plowing forward, driving herself under the water, scooping up the ocean like a massive shovel. McVay ordered the radio room to send an SOS. "Send it plain," he shouted. "We have been torpedoed. Send our position." The radio room was a scene of desperate heroism. The room was filled with smoke. The equipment was damaged. The radio operators were frantically keying the distress signal to USS Lot 12N long 135E. They believed the message went out. They saw the needle on the transmitter jump, indicating a signal was being sent. But did anyone hear it? This question would haunt the Navy for decades. We now know that 3 different stations received faint signals. One operator was drunk. One operator had been told not to wake his commanding officer. One station thought it was a Japanese trap because of secrecy, incompetence, and bad luck. No rescue was launched. The world heard the Indy scream, and the world turned over and went back to sleep. Back on the bridge, the list increased to 45 degrees. You could no longer walk on the deck. You had to crawl on the bulkheads, walls. Captain McVay realized the ship was doomed. He gave the order that no captain ever wants to give: abandon ship. But there was no organized evacuation. There were no PA systems to broadcast the order. The word had to be passed by shouting, man to man, down the lines of terrified sailors. Abandon ship. Pass the word. The lifeboats were useless. As the ship rolled onto her side, the boats on the high side swung inward and couldn't be launched. The boats on the low side were already underwater. The men had to jump. They grabbed K-POC life vests stiff, canvas jackets filled with fibrous material. They grabbed rubber rafts if they could find them. Most had nothing. They stood on the rail of the overturning ship, looking down into the black oil-slicked water 30 feet below. The propellers, still turning, were churning the water into a deadly froth. They jumped into a sea covered in heavy fuel oil. The oil was thick, viscous, and toxic. It coated their eyes, blinding them. It filled their noses and mouths, causing them to vomit. It made the survivors slippery, impossible to hold on to. At 12:26 a.m., just 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the USS Indianapolis began her final dive. She rolled completely onto her side, then continued to roll until she was upside down. For a terrifying moment, the massive hull hung there, the 4 giant propellers spinning in the air against the night sky. Then the bow dipped. The stern rose straight up, perpendicular to the ocean. Like a tombstone, hundreds of men were still clinging to the hull, too terrified to jump. As the ship slid under, they were dragged down with the suction. The ship groaned, a terrible, metallic shriek of bulkheads collapsing under the pressure. And then, she was gone. The Indianapolis plummeted toward the bottom of the Mariana Trench. 3 miles down, on the surface, the violence ended as quickly as it had begun. The roar of the explosions, the screaming of the steam, the grinding of the metal, it all vanished. In its place was a new, terrifying sound. The sound of 900 men, thrashing in the water, shouting names, coughing up oil, and screaming for help in the darkness. "Chief, where are you? I can't swim. Help me. Is anyone there?" They were alone. The ship was gone. The radio message had been ignored. They were scattered over miles of ocean, drifting in the current. Of the 1,196 men on board, about 300 went down with the ship. About 900 made it into the water. Most of them were alive. Most of them were uninjured. They believed that the Navy knew where they were. They believed that by morning, the seaplanes would land, the destroyers would arrive, and they would be saved. They had no idea that they had just entered the second circle of hell. They had survived the fire. Now they had to survive the water. And as the vibrations of the sinking ship faded into the deep, they attracted the attention of the residents of the Philippine Sea. The vibrations were like a dinner bell ringing in. The void. From miles away, the fins began to turn toward the oil slick. The Oceanic Whitetips were coming. Monday morning, July 30th, 1945, broke over the Pacific with a cruel beauty. The sun rose, painting the sky in pinks and oranges, illuminating a sea that was calm, rolling, and covered in a thick, shimmering blanket of black slime. As the light touched the water, the 900 survivors began to take stock of their reality. They were not a unified group. The speed of the sinking and the chaotic scattering of the men meant they were divided into several isolated clusters, spread out over miles of ocean. The main group, the largest cluster, holding perhaps 300 to 400 men, drifted without rafts. They were kept afloat only by their life vests. The raft group, smaller pockets of men, had managed to find the few cork life rafts and floater nets that had broken free from the ship. The captain's group, Captain McVay, was isolated on a small raft with a few others, miles away from the main body of his crew. In the first few hours of daylight, the mood was surprisingly optimistic. The men were in shock, yes, but they were Navy sailors. They knew the procedures. They knew the ship had sent an SOS. They assumed that overdue procedures would trigger a search the moment they failed to arrive in Lady on Tuesday morning. They scanned the horizon, expecting to see the silhouette of a destroyer or the wings of a PBY Catalina rescue plane at any moment. Every time a wave crested, 100 heads would lift, looking for salvation. But the horizon remained empty. The first enemy they faced was not the shark, but the fuel oil. The Indianapolis had been carrying thousands of gallons of heavy bunker fuel. When the ship broke apart, this fuel was released, creating a massive, toxic slick on the surface. The oil was inescapable. It coated the men in a thick black tar. It glued their eyelids shut. It filled their ears. When they gasped for air in the swells, they swallowed the oil, which induced violent vomiting. The vomiting accelerated their dehydration. As the sun rose higher, the oil heated up, baking onto their skin. It reflected the sunlight into their eyes, causing photophobia, an intense, painful sensitivity to light. Men tore strips from their clothing to blindfold themselves against the glare. The oil also made everything slippery. Men trying to hold onto each other or climb onto the few debris rafts would slide off, exhausted by the effort. In the largest group, chaos threatened to take over. The men were terrified, injured, and leaderless. But from the mass of black faces, a leader emerged. Lieutenant Commander Dr. Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer. Dr. Haynes was a man of immense compassion and iron will. He realized immediately that panic would kill them faster than the sea. He began to organize the mob. He couldn't treat the wounds, the burns, the broken bones, the lacerations, because he had no supplies. The salt water stung the open flesh, causing agony. All Haynes could do was offer words. He ordered the men to form a survival circle. They locked arms, creating the human chain. Ideally, the wounded were placed in the center of the circle, protected by the healthy men on the perimeter. This formation kept them together, preventing stragglers from drifting off to die alone. It also served another purpose. One Dr. Haynes didn't want to say aloud. Defense. Haynes knew the Pacific. He knew that a solitary swimmer was prey. A large group was an intimidating object. Around mid-morning, the screaming started at the edge of the groups. The vibrations of the sinking ship and the scent of blood in the water had traveled for miles. The apex predators of the open ocean had arrived. These were not great whites or bull sharks. They were oceanic whitetips, Carcharinus longimanus. Jacques Cousteau once called the oceanic whitetip the most dangerous of all sharks. They are pelagic hunters, creatures of the deep, open blue. Unlike coastal sharks that feed regularly, the whitetip lives in a food desert. It is an opportunistic scavenger. It is bold, inquisitive, and utterly fearless. The survivors saw the dorsal fins cutting the surface. Distinctive, rounded fins tipped with white. At first, the sharks were cautious. They were investigating. They circled the groups of men, bumping against their legs with their rough sandpaper skin. Imagine the terror. You are floating in 5,000 feet of water. You cannot see below the surface because of the oil and the murk. Suddenly, you feel a massive muscular object brush against your thigh. You feel the rough skin grate against yours. The sailors froze. They pulled their legs up to their chests, assuming the fetal position, a posture they called playing dead. Shark! Shark! The cry went down the line. Dr. Haynes and the officers shouted at the men to stay calm. Don't splash. Don't kick. Stay in the group. The sharks were testing them. They were bumping the survivors to see if they were alive, to see if they were dangerous, to see if they were food. On that first day, the sharks focused mostly on the dead, the bodies of men killed in the explosion or those who had succumbed to. Their injuries floated in the life jackets. The sharks would approach a corpse, nudge it, and then strike. The survivors watched in horror as bodies were dragged under violently, the water churning white and then red. But soon, the sharks grew bolder. They began to target the stragglers, the men who had drifted away from the main groups. A sailor, separated by a few yards, would suddenly scream. His head would jerk back. He would disappear beneath the surface. Then his life jacket would pop back up empty. The lesson was brutal and immediate. Unity is life. Isolation is death. The men in the center of the circle squeezed tighter. The men on the perimeter kicked and splashed when the fins got too close, trying to intimidate the monsters. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Miles away, Captain McVay sat on a small raft. He was physically safe from the sharks for now, but he was suffering a different kind of torture. He checked his watch. He checked the horizon. He knew the Navy procedures. He knew that if the ship didn't report in, alarm should be ringing in Leyte and Guam. He didn't know that due to a catastrophic mix of incompetence and apathy, no one had missed them. A radio man in Leyte had marked the Indianapolis as arrived without verifying it, assuming she was just late. The routing office in Guam assumed she was Leyte's problem. McVay was the captain. The burden of command does not end when the ship sinks. He felt the weight of 1,196 lives pressing on his chest. He scanned the sky until his eyes burned, praying for a plane, but the sky remained empty. The sun beat down, evaporating the precious moisture in their bodies. As the sun began to set on Monday evening, a new creeping dread settled over the men. They had survived the sinking. They had survived the first day, but they had not been rescued. The optimism of the morning evaporated. They realized they were spending the night in the water. Night in the ocean is a terrifying experience. The water cools, sapping body heat. The blackness is absolute. You cannot see the horizon. You cannot see the man next to you, and you cannot see the fins. You can only hear. You hear the water lapping. You hear the chattering of teeth from hypothermia. And every few minutes you hear a splash, a scream, and a silence. The sharks hunt at night. They rely on lateral lines to sense vibration. A shivering man creates vibrations. Dr. Haynes moved through the dark, holding men who were delirious with pain. He began to realize the grim mathematics of their situation. The life vests were kapok. They were rated to stay buoyant for 48 hours. After that, they would become waterlogged. The men would start to sink. The clock was ticking. They had to be found tomorrow. They had to be. But as the moon rose over the Philippine Sea, illuminating the oil slick and the dorsal fins cutting the water, the survivors of the USS Indianapolis drifted further into the void. Day 1 was over. The slaughter was just beginning. Tuesday morning, July 31st, 1945. The survivors of the USS Indianapolis watched the sunrise for the second time. For many, this dawn brought a crushing realization: the Navy wasn't coming. According to the original schedule, the Indianapolis was due to arrive in Leyte Gulf at 11 a.m. that morning. The men checked their watches, counting down the minutes. When 11 a.m. came and went with no plane overhead, a wave of despair rippled through the groups. The physical toll was becoming severe. The men had been in the water for over 30 hours. The salt water had begun to ulcerate their skin. Their lips were cracked and swollen. The fuel oil, baking in the sun, caused chemical burns on their faces and chests. But the greatest change was in the water below. The sharks, initially cautious, had learned. They had tested the perimeter. They had bumped the men. They had realized that these strange oil-covered creatures were helpless. On day 2, the curiosity ended. The feeding began. The behavior of the Oceanic Whitetips shifted. They were no longer solitary scavengers. They were hunting in packs. Survivors reported seeing fins cutting the water in coordinated patterns. The sharks would circle a group of sailors, tightening the loop, forcing the men to huddle closer together. Then, without warning, one shark would break formation and streak toward the center. The attacks were lightning fast. A sailor would be pulled under mid-sentence. The water would churn violently, then turn red. Crucially, the sharks discovered the weakness of the life vest. The kapok vests kept a man's head above water, but they left his legs dangling helplessly below. To a shark approaching from the deep, the legs looked like bait. Sailors learned to curl their legs up, floating in a fetal position. But maintaining this posture for hours was exhausting. As soon as a man's legs dropped from fatigue, he became a target. Dr. Lewis Haynes, moving between the wounded, witnessed the horror firsthand. He later recalled holding a man who was screaming in delirium. Suddenly, the man jerked violently. Haynes looked down to see that everything below the man's waist was gone. The doctor held the dying sailor until he passed, then released the body. He watched as it was immediately torn apart by the waiting pack. The terror was not just physical. It was psychological. The men couldn't see the attacks coming. They could only hear them, the scream, the splash, the silence. Every man wondered, am I next? Is it under me right now? This constant state of hypervigilance was exhausting. To sleep was to die. If a man drifted off, he might drift away from the group. The sharks picked off the stragglers first. The groups began to police themselves with a desperate, violent energy. If a man started to drift, his shipmates would scream at him, kick him, punch him, anything to keep him awake and inside the circle. But the circle itself was shrinking. As men died from wounds or shark attacks, the groups got smaller. The protection of the herd was failing. The sharks grew bolder, swimming right through the center of the clusters, their fins slapping the faces of the terrified sailors. One survivor, Woody James, described the experience. The sharks were around, hundreds of them. You'd hear guys scream, especially late in the afternoon. Seemed like the sharks were the worst then. Everything would be quiet, and then you'd hear somebody scream, and you knew a shark had got him. By the afternoon of day 2, a new enemy arrived. More insidious than the sharks: thirst. The human body can survive weeks without food, but only days without water. In the tropical heat, surrounded by salt water that they could not drink, the dehydration accelerated. The brain, deprived of water, begins to malfunction. The line between reality and nightmare blurs. Men began to hallucinate. It started with simple visions. A sailor would point to the horizon and say, "Look, an island." Others would look and see nothing but empty ocean. But the desperate mind is powerful. Soon, 10 men would see the island. They would describe the palm trees, the girls on the beach, the fresh water springs. Some men broke away from the group, swimming furiously toward the mirage. They swam until they exhausted themselves and drowned, or until the sharks took them. Other hallucinations were more dangerous. Some men believed the ship hadn't sunk. They claimed the Indianapolis was just below the surface, and the mess hall was open. "I'm going down to get a cold drink," a sailor would say. He would unclip his life vest and dive. He never came back. Ultimate killer was the salt water. As the thirst became unbearable, discipline broke. Men knew they shouldn't drink the ocean water. They had been trained not to. But the urge was overpowering. A sailor would take a small sip, thinking it would wet his throat. Then another. The salt water acts as a poison. It dehydrates the body further, drawing water out of the cells. It attacks the kidneys and the brain. Within minutes of drinking deep, a man would go mad. The salt water madness was terrifying to witness. Men would start foaming at the mouth. They would become incredibly strong and violent. They would attack their shipmates, believing they were Japanese spies or demons. Dr. Haynes and the other officers had to fight their own men. They had to hold them down until the seizure passed or until the man died. In the crowded water, a thrashing. Maniac was a beacon for the sharks. Often, the group had to make the heartbreaking decision to push the madman away, to cast him out of the circle to save the rest. As the sun set on Tuesday night, the situation was critical. The sharks were in a frenzy. The cooler water of the night seemed to energize them. The attacks became continuous. The survivors linked arms again, but the chains were shorter now. The water was colder. The hope was gone. In the darkness, the hallucinations turned paranoid. Groups of men began to fight each other. "He's got water. He's hiding it. That guy is a Jap. Kill him." Knives were drawn. Fights broke out in the water. Men drowned each other in a frenzy of suspicion. Captain McVay, drifting miles away on his raft, heard the distant screams echoing over the water. He felt a crushing guilt. He was the captain. He was responsible for every life in that black water. And he was powerless to save them. He prayed for the dawn. But he knew that with the sun would come the thirst, and with the light would come the sight of the fins. Day 2 ended with the realization that they were not just fighting the ocean. They were fighting their own minds, and they were losing. Wednesday, August 1st, 1945. The sun rose like a hammer for the men still floating in the Philippine Sea. The dawn brought no relief, only the terrifying visibility of their own deterioration. Their faces were unrecognizable, swollen, blackened by oil and blistered by the relentless UV radiation. Their tongues had swollen to twice their normal size, forcing their mouths open, making speech a painful, croaking rasp. But the most dangerous change was happening below the waterline. Kapok life vests, designed to stay buoyant for 48 hours, were now past their limit. They were becoming waterlogged. The men noticed they were sitting lower in the water. To keep their heads above the surface, they had to expend precious energy treading water. The chin straps of the vests rubbed raw sores into their necks. The salt water ate into the sores. The pain was constant, but on day 3, the physical pain became secondary to the mental collapse. This was the day the discipline of the United States Navy finally shattered under the weight of biological necessity. The enemy was no longer the shark. It was the phantom. In survival situations, hallucinations are usually individual. A starving man sees a feast. A thirsty man sees a river. But on the Indianapolis, the hallucinations became collective. Entire groups of men shared the same delusion. It spread like a virus through the huddled circles. One of the most common visions was the food island. Around noon, a sailor shouted that he saw an island just a few miles away. He described it in vivid detail. A white sandy beach, a hotel with an open bar, and crates of cold oranges. "I was just there," he would claim. "I just swam back to tell you guys. The Seabees are there. They have cold water." Desperate for hope, the men around him believed. They didn't just hope it was true. They saw it too. A group of 20 or 30 men would detach themselves from the survival circle and swim furiously toward the empty horizon. Dr. Haynes and the surviving officers screamed at them to stop. "There's nothing there. Come back." But the men couldn't hear. They swam until their strength gave out, then they sank. Or the sharks took them. The main group would watch as the swimmers disappeared one by one. Dragged under by predators, they no longer had the strength to fight. The hallucinations grew, more elaborate and bizarre. Some men believed the Indianapolis had not sunk, but was hovering just below the surface. They claimed the ship's freshwater scuttlebutts, fountains, were still working. "I'm going down for a drink," a sailor would rasp. He would unclasp his life vest, his only lifeline, and hand it to a buddy. "Hold this, I'll be right back." He would dive. The group would wait for him to resurface. He never did. Others believed there was a hidden airfield beneath the waves. They swore they could see American planes parked on the ocean floor. They dove to try and fly them. The most tragic delusion involved the families. Men began to have conversations with their mothers or wives. They believed their loved ones were in the water with them, or just out of reach. They held animated, one-sided conversations with ghosts, smiling through cracked, bloody lips. The ocean had become a theater of the mind, and every scene ended in death. As the thirst deepened, the hallucinations turned dark. The camaraderie that had held them together on day 1 curdled into suspicion. The men began to believe there were Japanese infiltrators among them. The logic of the madness was terrifying. Why hasn't the Navy come? Because someone is jamming the signal. Someone here is a spy. Men looked at their shipmates, covered in black oil, eyes wild, speaking gibberish, and saw monsters. "That guy, he's a Jap. He's cutting the lines." Fights broke out. In the water, a fight is a death sentence. Men grappled with each other, forcing heads underwater. Knives, which had been saved to fight sharks, were now pulled on fellow Americans. Dr. Haynes spent the day swimming from group to group, risking his own life to break up these fights. he would grab a delirious sailor and shout his rank and name, trying to snap him back to reality. "I am Dr. Haynes, look at me. We are Americans. Sometimes it worked, often it didn't." Haynes later recounted the horror of seeing men he had known for years drowning each other in a frenzy of paranoid delusion. The survival circles disintegrated. The tightly packed groups that had deterred the sharks broke apart into smaller, vulnerable clusters of suspicious, violent men. The sharks took full advantage of the chaos. The splashing, the fighting, and the separation made the hunting easy. The Oceanic Whitetips moved through the water with impunity. On day 3, the sharks didn't just attack the perimeter. They surfaced in the middle of the groups. Survivors recall the feeling of rough skin sliding past their chests, the water suddenly boiling, and the man next to them vanishing without a sound. The sharks seemed to sense the weakening pulse of the group. They became bolder, launching frenzied feeding attacks that claimed dozens of men in minutes. The water on the groups was perpetually stained with blood, which attracted more sharks from miles away. It was a feedback loop of death. Even the officers were not immune. The burden of command was crushing. Captain McVay, isolated on his raft, was holding onto his sanity by a thread. He was tormented by the vision of his ship going down. He hallucinated that he was back home, or that he was on the bridge of the ship. Other officers succumbed completely. One lieutenant, a respected leader, suddenly stood up in the water, hallucinating that he was standing on a shallow reef, and began giving orders to a phantom crew to man the guns. He collapsed and died moments later from exhaustion. The chain of command had dissolved. There were no ranks anymore. There were only the living and the dying. Wednesday night fell. The darkness brought the usual terror, but now it was compounded by the fact that the men were physically failing. Their kidneys were shutting down. Their blood had thickened to sludge. Their hearts were laboring to pump. Many men simply drifted into a coma and died quietly in their life jackets. When the sun rose the next morning, the survivors would find themselves tied to corpses. Those who were still conscious huddled together, shivering violently. They sang songs to keep awake. "Good night, Irene, for he's a jolly good fellow." Their voices cracked and tuneless, drifting over the black water. They knew, with a cold, hard certainty, that they would not survive another day. If the sun rose on Thursday without a ship, it was over. The vests would sink. The sharks would finish them. They were 900 miles from land, forgotten by their country and erased from the map. But as they prayed for the end, a miracle was winding its way. Through the clouds, a single twin-engine plane, flying a routine patrol, was about to make a mistake that would change history. The angel was coming. But for hundreds of men, it was already too late. Thursday morning, August 2nd, 1945. For the men in the water, the sunrise on the 4th day was a death sentence. They had survived the sinking, the oil, the sun, the thirst, and the sharks for nearly 90 hours. But the limits of human physiology had been reached. The Kapok life vests were waterlogged. Men were sinking lower, the water lapping at their chins. To take a breath required a conscious, exhausting effort. The moment a man fell asleep or lost consciousness, he drowned. The groups had disintegrated. The discipline of Dr. Haynes was gone. It was now a silent, drifting graveyard of scattered survivors and corpses. The hallucinations had given way to a comatose stupor. Most of the men were waiting to die. They no longer looked at the sky. They looked down into the blue void, waiting for the shadow of the shark to end it. But high above them, at 8,000 feet, a routine patrol was about to go wrong in exactly the right way. Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn was flying a PV-1 Ventura bomber on a standard anti-submarine patrol from the island of Peleliu. He was not looking for the USS Indianapolis. He didn't even know she was missing. Around 11 a.m., a trailing antenna weight on his plane snapped. The long wire antenna began whipping wildly in the slipstream, threatening to damage the tail of the aircraft. Gwyn handed the controls to his co-pilot and went back to the belly of the plane to reel in the wire. As he wrestled with the winch, he happened to glance out the small window in the floor of the fuselage. Below him, miles of ocean stretched out. But something caught his eye. A smudged dot. It was a massive oil slick, miles long, shimmering on the surface. Gwyn rushed back to the cockpit. He assumed he had found a damaged Japanese submarine that had been forced to submerge while leaking fuel. It was a prime target. He ordered his bombardier to open the bay doors. He dropped the plane into a steep dive, preparing to depth charge the enemy sub. As the bomber screamed down toward the water, getting closer to the surface to line up the attack, Gwyn's eyes scanned the oil slick. He saw bumps on the water, debris, black shapes, bobbing in the swell. He leveled off at 300 feet. He squinted. The debris was moving, and then he saw it. A hand, a splash. A face turned upward. "My God," Gwyn shouted over the intercom. "Those are men." He pulled up hard, aborting the bombing run just seconds before dropping explosives on the survivors. Gwyn circled back. He dropped to 200 feet. Now he could see them clearly. Hundreds of black, oil-covered heads bobbing in the swells. They were waving frantically, splashing water to get his attention. Gwyn immediately radioed his base at Peleliu. Sighted many men in water. Lat 11 to 30N, long 133 to 30E. The base radioed back, confused. "Troop transport? Convoy?" "No," Gwyn replied. "Just men, hundreds of them." He didn't know who they were. He didn't know they were the crew of the Indianapolis. He just knew they were dying. Gwyn opened his bomb bay doors again. But this time, he didn't drop depth charges. He dropped life. Rafts, cans of water, and a sonobuoy, a radio transmitter, to mark the spot. Then he did the only thing he could do. He climbed back to altitude and circled, transmitting a homing signal, becoming a lighthouse in the sky. Gwyn's message was picked up by a PBY Catalina, a large, slow, amphibious flying boat piloted by Lieutenant Adrian Marks. Marks was already in the air on a different mission. When he heard the report of many men in water, he turned his lumbering plane toward Gwyn's coordinates. When Marks arrived on the scene, he was horrified. From his vantage point, he could see what Gwyn initially missed. He saw the men. But he also saw the sharks. The water was clear enough from the air to see the dark shapes of the Oceanic Whitetip swarming around the stragglers. Marks watched as sharks darted in and attacked men who were too weak to fight back. He saw a shark grab a sailor and drag him under. Marks looked at his crew. He made a decision that would end his career if it went wrong, but would save his soul if it went right. Navy regulations strictly forbade landing a PBY in the open ocean if the swells were greater than a few feet. The waves below were 12 feet high. Landing a fragile seaplane in those conditions was suicide. The plane would likely break apart on impact. Marks got on the intercom. "I'm going down." He didn't ask for permission. He just did it. Marks lined up his approach. He stalled the massive plane just inches above the wave tops, trying to find a trough between the swells. He slammed the PBY onto the water. The plane bounced violently. Rivets popped. The hull groaned. Water sprayed over the cockpit. But the plane held together. Marks taxied his floating plane toward the survivors. He cut the engines to avoid chopping up men with the propellers. Now, the PBY became a lifeboat. Marks and his crew began pulling men out of the water. They targeted the single swimmers first, the ones most vulnerable to the sharks. The survivors were in terrible shape. Their skin sloughed off when the airmen grabbed their arms. They were emaciated, covered in oil, and delirious. Some were too weak to hold onto the rescue rings. The airmen had to lean out and grab them by the belts. Soon, the inside of the plane was full. The fuselage was packed with vomiting, weeping, dying men, but there were still hundreds in the water. And the sun was setting. Marks realized he couldn't take off. The plane was overloaded, but he refused to stop. He ordered his crew to start stacking men on the wings. They pulled survivors up onto the massive flat wings of the Catalina. They used parachute cord to tie the men down so they wouldn't slide off into the sea by nightfall. The PBY looked like a grotesque floating sculpture. It was completely covered in human bodies inside the cabin, on the fuselage, and lining the wings wingtip to wingtip. Marks had picked up 56 men. He had turned his aircraft into a sanctuary. The men on the wings, shivering in the night air, looked down into the water. They could still see the fins circling the plane, bumping against the pontoons. But for the first time in 4 days, they were dry. They were safe. As darkness fell on Thursday night, a light appeared on the horizon. It was the USS Cecil J. Doyle, a destroyer escort. Her captain, W. Graham Claytor, had intercepted Gwynn's earlier message. Without waiting for orders, Claytor had turned his ship and raced toward the coordinates at full speed. Captain Claytor knew that searching for men in the dark was nearly impossible. He also knew that submarine I-58 might still be lurking in the area. Turning on lights was a death wish, but Claytor made a command decision that mirrored the bravery of Adrian Marks. He ordered his largest searchlight turned on. He pointed the beam straight up into the sky. It was a beacon, a pillar of light reaching into the heavens. To the men floating in the water, scattered over miles of ocean, that beam of light was the finger of God. It meant one thing. They knew. The men who were conscious began to weep. They shouted to the men who had drifted into comas, "Look, the Navy is here. Look at the light." The nightmare of the Indianapolis was ending. The sharks, sensing the vibrations of the approaching destroyer engines, began to scatter into the deep. The rescue had begun. But for the crews of the Doyle and the other ships now racing to the scene, the horror was just beginning. They were about to see what 4 days of sharks and sun does to a human body. Friday morning, August 3rd, 1945. The beam of light from the USS J. Doyle had served its purpose. It acted as a lighthouse in the middle of the Pacific Void. Throughout the night, other ships converged on the scene. The high-speed transports USS Bassett and USS Register, along with more destroyers. As the sun rose, the crews of these rescue ships looked out over the water and gasped. The ocean was littered with hundreds of bobbing heads. But for every head that moved, there were 2 or 3 that bobbed listlessly, corpses held up by waterlogged vests, surrounded by the circling fins of the sharks. The rescue captains ordered their ships to stop. They lowered whaleboats and landing nets. They moved slowly, terrified of running over the very men they had come to save. The water was still thick with the toxic fuel oil. The rescuers, leaning over the gunwales, were hit by the stench of oil, vomit, and death. The physical extraction of the survivors was a gruesome task. The men were coated in such a thick layer of black oil that they looked like statues. Their eyes were swollen shut. Their lips were cracked open, bleeding. Many were naked, having stripped off their clothes in the delirium of the heat. When the rescuers reached down to grab the arms of the survivors to haul them into the boats, a horrific medical phenomenon occurred. The skin on the survivors, arms and hands, macerated by 90 hours of salt water and oil, simply sloughed off. It is known medically as degloving. The rescuers would pull, and the skin would slide off the flesh like a wet glove, leaving raw muscle exposed. The rescuers were horrified. They had to change tactics. They stopped grabbing arms. Instead, they grabbed the back of the life belts or used cargo nets to scoop the men up like fish. The survivors were too weak to help. They were essentially dead weight, paralyzed by hypothermia and exhaustion. As they were hauled onto the steel decks of the destroyers, they collapsed, unable to stand, unable to speak, unable to believe they were solid. Getting the men out of the water did not stop the nightmare. The psychological trauma of the Indianapolis followed them onto the rescue ships. the saltwater madness was still raging in their brains. On the USS Bassett, survivors were laid out on the deck. But as soon as they were put down, they began to scream. They hallucinated that the rescue ship was a Japanese vessel. They believed the American sailors giving them water were Japanese soldiers trying to poison them. Some survivors tried to jump back into the water. They fought the medics with the last reserves of their hysterical strength. "Don't drink it. It's poisoned," they screamed, knocking cups of fresh water from the hands of the nurses. The crews of the rescue ships were overwhelmed. They were not hospital ships, they were combat vessels. They ran out of beds. They ran out of blankets. They ran out of fluid. The sailors of the Bassett and Doyle gave up their own bunks. They stripped the sheets off their beds. They used engine rags to wipe the oil from the survivors' faces. It took hours to calm the men down. The survivors had to be restrained, tied to stretchers, until the fresh water and sedatives could flush the salt toxins from their blood. While the survivors were tended to, the boats continued their grim work in the water. They had to distinguish the living from the dead. It was a difficult task. Men in comas looked dead. Men who were dead bobbed in the swell as if they were swimming. Rescue crews would pull a boat alongside a floating figure. A sailor would reach out and check for a pulse or a blink response. "This one's alive. Get him in. This one's gone. Let him go." The sharks were still there. They circled the rescue boats, frustrated by the interference. The rescue crews often had to beat the sharks away with boat hooks or shoot them with rifles to get to the bodies. The dead were collected. Their dog tags were removed for identification. But the ships were too small to carry hundreds of corpses. The captains made a grim decision. The bodies that were identified were weighted down and buried at sea immediately. The Navy prayer was read over the loudspeakers, a continuous, rolling funeral service that lasted all day. Those who were too badly decomposed or eaten by sharks to be identified were allowed to sink. They returned to the deep, their names lost to the water dock around noon on Friday. A search boat spotted a small raft miles away from the main group. On it sat Captain Charles McVay. He was in better physical shape than many of his crew, having had access to a raft and a small amount of emergency rations. But emotionally, he was shattered. As the rescuers pulled him aboard the USS Ringness, McVay did not ask for food or water. His first question was, how many? He wanted to know how many of his boys had made it. When the final count came in, the number broke him. Of the 1,196 men who sailed from Guam, 316 survived. 879 were dead. It was the greatest loss of life at sea from a single ship in the history of the U.S. Navy. McVay sat on the deck of the rescue ship, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the wall. He had survived the war. He had survived the sinking. He had survived the sharks. But he knew, with the certainty of a career officer, that the Navy would need someone to blame for this catastrophe. He was the captain. He was the only one left to punish. The rescue operation concluded on August 8, 1945. The survivors were transported to hospitals on Guam. Ironically, on August 6th, while the men were still being pulled from the water, the B-29 Enola Gay took off. From Tinian, the very island the Indianapolis had delivered the cargo to just 10 days earlier, the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb Little Boy on Hiroshima. The cargo of the Indianapolis detonated with the force of 15,000 tons of TNT, vaporizing the city and effectively ending the war. The survivors heard the news in their hospital beds. They cheered. They realized what their mission had been. They had delivered the end of the war, but their victory was hollow. Back in the United States, the families of the crew were celebrating the coming peace. They were waiting for their sons to come home for Christmas. Then the telegrams began to arrive. The Navy Department deeply regrets to inform you ... In small towns across America, the joy of VJ Day victory over Japan was silenced by the grief of the Indianapolis families. The Navy, embarrassed by the delay in the rescue and the scale of the loss, tried to bury the story in the news cycle of the Japanese surrender. But the questions began immediately. Why was the ship alone? Why was there no escort? Why did no one notice they were missing for 4 days? The Navy needed an answer, and they decided that the answer would not be bureaucratic incompetence. The answer would be captain's error. The sharks in the water were gone. Now the sharks in the courtroom began to circle. In August 1945, the United States was drunk on victory. The atomic bombs had fallen. Japan had surrendered. The boys were coming home, but in the halls of the Navy Department in Washington, D.C., there was panic. The story of the USS Indianapolis was leaking out. The press had questions that the Navy could not comfortably answer. Why was the ship sailing alone in hostile waters? Why was the SOS ignored? Why did it take 4 days for the Navy to realize a heavy cruiser was missing? The answers to these questions pointed directly to systemic incompetence at the highest levels of the Pacific Command. Routing officers had ignored intelligence reports of submarines. Port directors and Lady had failed to report the ship's non-arrival. Communication centers had dismissed the SOS messages. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, knew that an investigation into these failures would be a PR disaster. It would stain the Navy's triumph. The Navy needed a narrative that shifted the blame away from the system and onto an individual. They needed a scapegoat. They chose Captain Charles McVay. McVay was a convenient target. He was alive. He was the son of an admiral, which made him part of the club, but also expendable if it meant saving the institution. In November 1945, just months after being pulled from the shark-infested water, Captain McVay was informed that he would face a general court-martial. He was the only captain in the entire history of the United States Navy to be court-martialed for losing his ship to enemy action during wartime. Hundreds of other ships had been sunk. No other captain had been treated like a criminal. The trial began on December 3, 1945, at the Washington Navy Yard. The atmosphere was tense. The press gallery was packed. The Navy charged McVay with 2 specific counts: failure to issue a timely order to abandon ship, hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. The first charge collapsed almost immediately. Survivors, including Dr. Lewis Haynes, testified that McVay had indeed given the order, but the communication system had been destroyed by the explosions. The destruction was so swift that no order could have saved more men. That left the second charge: failure to zigzag. It was a technicality. Navy regulations stated that zigzagging was a tactic to be used at the captain's discretion during daylight or poor visibility. McVay's defense argued that the night was pitch black, visibility was poor, and therefore zigzagging was not required. The Navy prosecutor argued that if McVay had zigzagged, the torpedoes would have missed. To prove this point, the Navy pulled a stunt that shocked the American public and the military world. They brought in a star witness for the prosecution. They brought in the enemy. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked Makatsura Hashimoto, the former commander of the Japanese submarine I-58. It was unprecedented. Just months earlier, this man had been killing American sailors. Now he was being sworn in to testify against an American officer in a U.S. Navy court. The press went wild. Politicians were outraged. But the Navy was desperate to secure a conviction. Hashimoto, speaking through a translator, was respectful but firm. He described the attack in detail. He explained how he spotted the silhouette of the Indianapolis against the night sky. Then, McVay's defense lawyer asked the crucial question: if the Indianapolis had been zigzagging, would it have made a difference? Hashimoto's answer was as devastating to the prosecution's case. He said simply, no. He explained that at the short range and angle of the attack, and with the advanced chitin-type torpedoes he carried, though he used standard ones, A zigzag pattern would not have saved the ship. He would have sunk her anyway. The courtroom fell. Silent. The man who fired the torpedoes had just exonerated the man who received them, but the Navy judges, under pressure from Admiral King, ignored the testimony. They needed a conviction. On December 19, 1945, the verdict was delivered. Captain Charles McVay was found guilty of hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. The sentence was surprisingly light. He lost 100 numbers in his temporary rank, a seniority penalty, and 100 numbers in his permanent rank. Essentially, his career was stalled, but he wasn't sent to prison. The leniency of the sentence revealed the hypocrisy of the trial. If McVay was truly criminally negligent for the deaths of 879 men, he should have been dismissed or imprisoned. The light sentence was a signal that the Navy knew he wasn't really to blame, but they had successfully pinned the official record on him. McVay had been branded. In the eyes of history and the public, he was the man who sank the Indianapolis. The Navy quietly remitted the sentence later, allowing McVay to retire as a rear admiral in 1949, but the guilty verdict remained on his permanent record. McVay retired to Litchfield, Connecticut. He tried to live a quiet life. He gardened. He collected toy soldiers. He tried to forget the screams in the water. But the world wouldn't let him forget. Every year, around Christmas, the letters would arrive. They came from the grieving mothers, wives and fathers of the boys who died in the Philippine Sea. They were letters of pure, unadulterated hatred. Why did you kill my son? You are alive and my boy is shark bait. I hope you rot in hell for what you did. The Navy never explained to these families that the ship wasn't reported missing for 4 days. They never explained that the SOS was ignored. They let McVay take the full force of the family's grief. McVay read every letter. He never responded, but he absorbed the pain. He carried the guilt of 879 deaths not just in his memory, but in his mailbox. The burden became too heavy. On a cold afternoon, November 6, 1968, 23 years after the sinking, Charles McVay walked out onto the back porch of his home. He was 70 years old. The survivors of the Indianapolis loved him. They had always maintained his innocence, inviting him to reunions, saluting him as their captain. But the love of his men could not silence the hate of the families or the judgment of the Navy. McVay held a toy soldier in one hand, a memento of a simpler, controlled world. In the other hand, he held his service revolver. He put the gun to his temple and pulled the trigger. Captain Charles McVay was the last casualty of the USS Indianapolis. The Sharks didn't get him in 1945, but the guilt, authorized by the U.S. Navy, finally finished the job. He died a convicted criminal in the eyes of his country. It seemed the story would end there, a tragedy compounded by an injustice, buried in the archives of history. But history has a way of resurfacing. 30 years later, an unlikely hero would emerge to fight the Navy one last time. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't an admiral. He was a 12-year-old boy doing a school history project. For decades, the story of the USS Indianapolis faded from the American consciousness. It was a dark footnote, remembered only by the families of the dead and the dwindling group of survivors who gathered for reunions to toast their fallen captain. But in 1975, the story resurfaced in pop culture through the movie Jaws. In a chilling monologue, the character Quint, a shark hunter, recounts his survival of the Indianapolis. He tells the story of the sharks, the screams, and the delivery of the bomb. Millions of Americans heard the story for the first time in a movie theater. One of the people who eventually saw that movie was a 12-year-old boy from Pensacola, Florida, named Hunter Scott. In 1996, Hunter needed a topic for his school history fair project. He remembered the shark story. He went to the library. He was shocked to find that the captain of the ship had been court-martialed. To a 12-year-old sense of justice, it didn't make sense. If the ship was on a secret mission and denied an escort, how was it the captain's fault? Hunter decided to find out. He placed an ad in a Navy newspaper looking for survivors. Hunter Scott did what the U.S. Navy had refused to do for 50 years. He listened to the men. He interviewed over 150 survivors. He gathered their testimonies. He reviewed the deck logs of other ships. Hunter discovered crucial evidence that had been suppressed or ignored at the trial. He found proof that the SOS signals had been received by 3 separate stations, but were dismissed as a prank or ignored by lazy operators. He highlighted the fact that the Navy knew Japanese submarines were in the area, thanks to ultra code breaking, but never told. McVay, Hunter's History Fair project, grew into a national movement. The media picked up the story. The boy who wants to clear the captain. The survivors of the Indianapolis, now old men, rallied behind Hunter. They saw in him the grandson they never had, and the champion they always needed. They formed a survivors coalition and marched on Washington, D.C. Navy resisted. The old guard did not want to admit that the court-martial of 1945 was a sham. They did not want to admit that admirals had sacrificed a captain to save their own reputations, but the pressure was overwhelming. Hunter Scott testified before Congress. Commander Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine captain, now an old man and a Shinto priest, wrote a letter to the Senate, reiterating what he had said in 1945. I would have sunk the Indianapolis no matter what. In October 2000, Congress passed a resolution exonerating Captain Charles McVay III. President Bill Clinton signed it. The resolution stated that McVay was not culpable for the loss of the USS Indianapolis. It was a total victory. The conviction was not technically overturned. A court-martial cannot be undone by Congress, but the record was corrected. The stain was removed. Captain McVay was dead, but his honor was restored. The survivors wept in the Senate gallery. They had finally brought their captain home. Today, the USS Indianapolis lies 3.5 miles deep in the Philippine Sea. The wreckage was finally located in 2017 by a team led by Paul Allen. She sits upright on the bottom, her hull preserved in the eternal darkness, a steel tomb for the hundreds of boys who never made it out. The story of the Indy is a story of extremes. It is the story of the ultimate weapon, the atomic bomb. It is the story of the ultimate horror being eaten alive. And it is the story of the ultimate injustice. But, thanks to the survivors and a 12-year-old boy, it is also a story of loyalty. The crew never gave up on each other in the water, and they never gave up on their captain in life. The sharks took their bodies, but they could not take their brotherhood. Thank you for listening to Shark Water, the terrifying true story of the USS Indianapolis on History by Blood. A Audiobook. If this deep dive into the courage and tragedy of the Pacific War captivated you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support ensures these stories are never forgotten. Let us know in the comments below. Do you believe the Navy was right to court-martial Captain McVay to maintain accountability? Or was he purely a scapegoat for the mistakes of others?